Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics. This week we're looking at how to deliver effective public services and also how can academic research make a difference. Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. How can you best deliver effective public services? Is it better to exert top-down control over the work of bureaucrats on the ground through targets, monitoring, and prescribed procedures so that slacking or corruption or inconsistency can be prevented? Or can more be achieved if you free up bureaucrats to work out their own approaches, utilising their practical knowledge and allowing their desire to do a good job to flourish? Well, my colleague, Dr. Dan Honig, is Associate Professor of Public Policy here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and he argues that we've tended to get the balance wrong, with too much top-down control and not enough freedom on the ground. In two books, one of them published in 2018 by Oxford University Press, and the other on its way, Dan sets out the case for a new approach. And his work is making waves not just in academia. At the end of 2021, he was announced by Apolitical as one of its 100 most influential academics in government in the world. And I'm delighted to say that Dan joins me now. Dan, many congratulations on that fantastic accolade, and welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. And could we start with your own story here? So you're writing a book at the moment called Mission-Driven Bureaucrats. And I think it's fair to say that you're a mission-driven academic. Could you tell us how and why you've ended up in academia?
Thanks so much, Alan. So first, let me just say, really a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. And thanks for the kind words. So how did I end up in academia? Well, one could say, a series of bad decisions. I'm a cautionary tale to, no, I'm kidding. So I'm honored to be here, very excited to be at UCL. I love my job, feel very fortunate to have it. How I ended up here, I would say, though, is not so much an explicit plan, So I was working in policy circles, I'd run an NGO, I then went and was an aid management advisor, special assistant to successive ministers of finance in Liberia. And I found myself often thinking that I wished there was information out there for me that didn't seem to exist, like we were facing policy questions, policy challenges, which of course I didn't imagine that somebody had done a study on what the Liberian Ministry of Finance should do in this particular question, in this particular moment. But I thought there should be information out there that could inform our decision. And over again, I found that wasn't the case. And so I thought it might be fun to go study for a PhD without really, frankly, planning to become an academic, to think about some of those questions. And to the sort of way you framed my work, my former book and the one I'm currently writing, one of the questions I found central, or one of the things I found most puzzling, was how often the people who I interacted with seemed to be doing good work, not in consonance with the rules of their organization, but in conflict with them, right? So somehow to generate welfare, it seemed to me, as a representative of foreign aid donor or as a bureaucrat in many of the ministries and agencies I interacted with, required you to do things that were outside normal procedure, which made me wonder what precisely was wrong with normal procedure, and how did we end up with a world, if my perceptions were right, in which the organization did not have rules that allowed the best bureaucrats to do the best work. And that's kind of what led me here. And then, I finished my PhD, applied for jobs very clearly, telling people that my interest was in studying real world policy questions. And I was fortunate enough to find employment first at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, to whom I'm very grateful, and now at UCL, where that is, kind of encouraged, fostered, at least tolerated, and feel very, very fortunate to have that position.
Yeah, so it sounds like you were working away on the ground. You had a kind of hunch that things could be done better, but you didn't have the evidence base that would allow you to make the argument that, hey, folks, there's a different way of doing things. And you felt, therefore, that the contribution of academia could potentially be to provide that evidence base. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. I would go beyond that to say it wasn't just with regards to this central question I illustrated and drove to, given the intro, regarding how bureaucrats are managed, with regards to lots of questions. I don't think there's a very small space called things that could be done better, and that perhaps many practitioners have an instinct could be done better, but for which we don't have evidence, and where systematic evidence could be useful in either, as you say, confirming or disconfirming those suspicions. So another case, just by way of illustration, I led the technical work around Liberia's debt relief negotiations around the highly indebted poor countries initiative, right? So this is kind of you're in quite a lot of debt. If I recall the figures correctly, Liberia had $4.5 billion of debt. On a GDP of $350 million or something like that. So it would have taken 100 years, more than 100 years, if every cent of GDP went to service the debt, and it did not increase at an interest rate greater than the rate of growth to relieve that debt. And we're trying to get debt relief here, right? And sort of how you proceed in those negotiations. Liberia was about the 45th, I think, country to go through this process. There was really very little guidance on sort of what led to better or worse deals from the standpoint of the developing country. And this is not like the only other case I can think of. There are, in my view, literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of relevant policy questions where there is a set of actors, but maybe we can't get clean identification that would allow sort of a publication to necessarily go into a top journal, or where academics have not sort of discovered the question in some ways. And I think that the world is full of unanswered questions that could be of academic value, but also could help to make the world a better place, could help to improve human welfare and flourishing.
It's interesting what you're saying there about getting proper identification. Some people might find that slightly technical language, but basically what you're saying there is that academics tend to pursue questions where they can do a really nice piece of research that will get them into a top journal. That's the kind of the prestige way of proceeding as an academic. But those aren't necessarily the questions that are most useful for the people on the ground that will allow them to do a better job. So there's a kind of tension between the two separate tracks that we have going on in the world here. One of the practitioners working in their world, desperate to get some evidence for things, and the other, the academics working in their world. And sometimes we could have a better connection between those two.
Yeah, exactly. That's very well put in my view. So, academia incentivizes nice, clean, bite-sized questions, which you can get clean, clear answers to. And the world is full of messy, interconnected things. That is not always opposed to answering nice, clean, clear questions that get published in prestige journals, but there is some tension there. And I think that, and also understanding that messy reality and figuring out sort of where the leverage points might be is pretty hard if you've only studied things from the outside, even if you've gone and visited the country a few times. And I think kind of the only way to do it well, at least the only way I've discovered to do it well, is to spend substantial time in the hallways talking to people, figuring out what's really going on over time, and then saying, I wonder if this could change, or figuring out which policymakers have questions that are really troubling them, and thinking, okay, what's the best way this can be answered, even if it's hard to imagine how that way of answering it will necessarily lead to kind of a nice, clean, bite-sized chunk that will easily go into a top-tier publication.
Yeah, we'll explore further in a little bit the how, once you've now that you've made that kind of leap into the world of academia, if you like, you retain a foot in the other camp, and you maintain those links. But let's just focus a little bit on the particular research questions that have been driving you recently. Top-down control of bureaucrats, you argue, is a problem. We do it too much. Why is that?
We do it too much because it's the levers we have, in my view. So that is to say, if you're standing on top of a messy system, if you're a senior manager, if you're a politician looking to change things, right? So how are you going to do that? Well, you certainly cannot, be physically present every time, I don't know, a nurse interacts with a patient, right? What you can do is you can set rules. And so you use the levers you have, right? You use the tools at your disposal. And so you set rules, you set targets, you put in process controls, or otherwise try to kind of orient and control the people who work in the system. And, that sometimes is a good idea. So I think you put it exactly right in saying we do it too much. So my argument isn't this is never effective or never appropriate, or that the optimal is to have no rules and no process controls. But in general, I think we tend to kind of overuse the tools we have, and that that has the tendency to lead us to kind of miss the downsides of using those tools. So what do I mean by those downsides? Well, if I face a bunch of process controls, a bunch of rules that require me to fill out a lot of paperwork each time I do things, or tell me certain things can't be done or need to be, heavily monitored and observed, I'm less likely to do those things, even if they're to the benefit of the people I serve, even if they lead to good action. And in addition, I think it crowds out kind of gathering of local knowledge, right? So, one of the big things academics talk about when we talk about bureaucracy is we've got this idea of kind of principal agent models. So that's like a principal is like a boss, and an agent's the person who works for that boss. And, the principal manages the agent, right? So agents generally are in places which are kind of information rich, and that information can't always be observed by the principal, and it can't always be codified and transmitted up a hierarchy. So the question is, how do we get that information kind of into the decision-making apparatus of the organization? Well, agents have to have an incentive to gather that information. So a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Jean Tirole and his co-author Philippe Aghion talk about this as kind of the trade-off between real versus formal authority. So if you don't give the agents on the ground real authority, they're not going to have an incentive to go out and figure out what's going on. Why learn the kind of messy reality of what's happening on the ground if at the end of the day I have to punch these buttons on Tuesday or do this thing irrespective of what I think the right thing to do is? I'm not going to gather that information. So organizations themselves become stupider, in my view, as a result of kind of these top-down controls sometimes, particularly uncertain environments or with tasks where it's really kind of hard to monitor and measure effectively. And so, we end up with this problem. So, if you buy my story that there's kind of a problem of too much control, and of course, there's also a potential problem of too little control. It's a little bit like a Goldilocks situation, right? So, the porridge could be too hot or too cold. But if Goldilocks, I don't know, had some kind of, disability and could not taste cold things, she would over-respond to the heat and the porridge would end up too cold. And that's kind of the world we're in. We don't see what we're missing. We don't see the value left on the table from less that we leave on the table because we control too much. Whereas we do see the downside of controlling too little, in that we see acts of kind of corruption and malfeasance. So agencies basically over-adapt towards too much control, and we end up with less public value than we should in the end.
Yeah, so let's just explore that balance a little bit further. So you've talked there about the importance of knowledge and the rich knowledge that people on the ground have. You're currently writing the second book on mission-driven bureaucrats, and you've got the argument here that actually too much control saps bureaucrats of their desire to do a good job.
Yes.
And that desire is actually a real and important thing, and can lead to all sorts of wonderful stuff if we just allow it to be freed.
That's exactly right. It not only saps the desire of bureaucrats to do a good job, it changes who those bureaucrats are. By which I mean, so like, if we think about today's bureaucrats, management today can sort of demotivate. When we see a bureaucrat not working very hard, we usually describe that bureaucrat as unmotivated. But maybe that bureaucrat is in fact demotivated. and could, in fact, be doing a very kind of like earnest, agentic, sort of work in a different management condition. So that's kind of like selection effects, right? So, but we could, treatment effects. But we could also think about selection effects. So that is, we could think about who comes in and goes out of the agency. So, if an agency is a really hard place to do the work that matters to me, and I'm somebody who cares about doing the work that matters to me, then I'm less likely to apply to join that agency. And if I've shown up for whatever reason, I'm more likely to say, you know what, my top choice was working for this agency, but that was because I thought I could do X. If I can't do X, if I can't, help kids go to school, then really in my day-to-day work, because there's too many rules, too much control, et cetera, well, I'm going to go do something else. I'll go work for an NGO. I'll go start a school of my own. And so the public service loses some of the most motivated or the most motivatable. And we get this kind of change in who the bureaucrats are. And so for both reasons, I think, we should also think about the way top-down controls change what the personnel who work for agencies want to do. And in that sense, since very little of what public servants do can, in fact, be completely monitored and measured, what they do with the discretion that is kind of inherent in their tasks. And let me just add one more thing, which is to say, most of my work experience, most of my life experience is in developing countries. And I think, I haven't said that before because I think everything I've said here applies also to the UK and the US, where I'm from, obviously, for those who are hearing my mellifluous, not so mellifluous tones on this podcast. But I think it's even more true in developing countries. As hard as the monitoring challenge is in the global north, it is all the harder in the global south. And I think there, this kind of way of thinking about the world will have even greater returns than here in the UK.
Can you give us a concrete example of this? Because, I guess for most listeners, it's going to be intuitively fairly obvious probably that you need to balance these two things, that going to either extreme wouldn't really be defensible. But obviously the difficult thing is to get that balance right. So, is there an example where we can see, yes, the balance was definitely too far towards top-down control in some case, and it was clear how reducing that control was able to lead to better outcomes?
Yeah. So let me give you a case of the first, where sadly the second didn't happen. So a case where too much control, I think, is clearly leading to bad outcomes. Though listeners can judge that for themselves. But actually, we didn't get the needed change. And so, and I guess I'll go back home for this one, which for me is Detroit. And I did some work joint with some scholars of social work at Wayne State University. That's our city university in Detroit, at their School of Social Work, Lena Ballard and Joanne Sobek. And the three of us basically looked at what was happening to people who went through a kind of high achievers recruitment program to join Child Protective Services. So Child Protective Services is the agency that intervenes or has the potential to intervene when there is some concern about a child's welfare in their own home. And, one of the stylized facts that really surprised me as we started talking about this, that in some ways led to the project, was that the average tenure in the agency, I don't think it's in the paper, and I could be slightly off on this, but basically the average person hired was leaving in something like 3 months, right? So new employees were turning over. So they thought they had a training problem. We thought they had a problem that it didn't matter what people were trained to do because they were just out the door. And as we sort of talked to people in the agency and talked to current and former workers, it was clear that basically this was an incredibly high intensity job, incredibly stressful job. I couldn't do this job, if I'm honest. I don't think I have the personal fortitude and character to be able to withstand this very difficult working environment. But it actually wasn't the working environment that was chasing people away. It was the sense that because of how many kids there were to serve and how few personnel there were, basically, you got to visit a home once, maybe twice, before you almost always had to make the decision to remove that child from the home so you could move on to the next case. And frankly, while I wish Wayne County and Detroit had a foster care system or a system that allowed children to have wonderful and thriving lives away from that initial home, that really isn't the case. You end up in quite difficult environments. Under care, I think, is the UK term for it. Yeah, and and as you do, you end up with substantially diminished life prospects. The relative to a happy, healthy, supportive home, of course. And so, these child protective services workers had the sense that basically the paperwork and rules, including a well-intentioned rule which tried to ensure that every official only had a certain number of cases. I believe the number was 8. You could only carry 8 cases. And you needed to get to cases within the first, week or 2 weeks that they'd been reported. But that meant you had to get rid of the old case so you could take on the new case. And so I see the logic of those rules. But in practice, what it was doing is it was chasing people out. And so, I've been talking kind of anecdotally here. Let me add a bit of data. So we look at these people who had been selected, who had gotten scholarships to attend, to get a master's, and had been selected. I think it's like 2%, 3% of the people were admitted into the program. And they were admitted on the basis not only of essays, but also of interviews, which were precisely about their long-term desire to stay in child protective services and care about children in the area. These people came into a program, they got a degree. There was a required period of tenure that otherwise they had to pay back their degree. And then lots and lots of them were leaving. And the question was, is our selection criteria wrong? As far as we can tell, no, we couldn't come up with a better way to select these people. But what we found was that in response to kind of standard motivational measures, the more people were motivated by the public service, the more people were motivated by the actual pro-social goal of the agency, by helping kids, the more likely they were to leave, right? So the more you cared about kids, the less likely you were to, in a few years, be in a job which is about caring about kids. And I guess the reason I use this is because you were talking about our intuitions before. I have the intuition, and I suspect the intuition is widely shared, that if you think about your hometown, you want the people caring about intervening on behalf of the most vulnerable children in your town to be people who care about the children. And I'm not saying the people at the job currently don't care at all. That's not what I'm saying. But you don't want to lose the people who care the most because the rules basically induce them to very quickly pull kids out of the home and give them de facto very little discretion, very little ability to exercise judgment in terms of making those decisions.
So I guess as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, because I'm an academic, I'm thinking about, well, what are the counter-arguments that someone might put to this?
Sure, please.
And there are obviously counter-arguments, and we've touched upon them briefly earlier about the idea that, well, if you give people greater freedom, then they might shirk more, there might be greater corruption. So, that's one side of it. But I suppose a further side that we haven't really mentioned at all is the concern that if you give more freedom to the bureaucrats on the ground, then there will be less equality in terms of how different people are treated. That different people will receive a very different kind of service. That some people might strike lucky and get someone who's really good and really passionate and does great stuff, but someone else might get a very different kind of service. And you can also start to kind of let seep into the system all sorts of unconscious biases and so on that the people have. That rules are there in order to reduce the impact of. I mean, how would you respond to those sorts of concerns?
I mean, so first, I would just say I think those are very valid concerns, and they are very much kind of worth considering in thinking about what the appropriate balance is. So I guess I would say two things. So first, you frame that as a hypothetical world that might occur were we to give people more discretion. I would argue for most people in most countries, that's the world they already live in, right? So, and indeed, that it is impossible to sufficiently eliminate discretion such that there is no possibility or no likelihood that subconscious bias and equal treatment will reign. So first, I'd say, unfortunately, we're in that scenario. And so the question is, on some margins, the question is, do we want the people exercising their unconscious bias to be the people who care the most about the outcome of, helping kids, or I don't know, keeping our streets clean, or protecting the environment, or whatever the public good is in that case. I think, and since we can't squeeze it all out, the question is, when is the prescription we currently have of tighter controls worse than, when is the medicine worse than the disease, right? And that's a complicated question. And I think that answer is different across place and space and time, and also depends on issues of values, right? So to what extent we think, equity versus welfare, to the extent that they are in tension with each other, which is the greater value. That said, I also think there's a kind of, you didn't say this, and I'm sure you don't think this, but there's a sort of subtext of that argument, which is, there is no way to hold bureaucrats accountable unless we have controls and rules and targets. And I don't think that's the case. I think that we can and should hold bureaucrats accountable. I just think that accountability likely often does not rest, or less than it currently does, rests with sort of top-down measures. And so what are our alternatives? Well, let's think about how doctors are held accountable, right? So there's an important job where we care about equity to patients, and we certainly care about the welfare of patients. Doctors do indeed report on many things. Many doctors would say too many things, that the top-down control is a problem in that profession as well. But there are also alternative sources of accountability, right? So first, because you can, in some contexts, look at actual outcomes, you can do that and use that as a basis for learning and for accountability. Second, you can review cases and educate judgment using what I would call kind of horizontal accountability, right? So, a case goes well or goes ill, doctors make rounds and talk about what happened, what they did, what might have been better, what might have been done differently. And of course, if a doctor frequently has bad patient outcomes, they stop being able to see patients, and that is entirely appropriate, right? But it is also not the case that any bad outcome leads to doctors being pulled out of the hospital. And while that may be a little scary for patients, that I think that's right, in the sense that we need doctors to be able to think and talk and educate their judgment and their intuitions and their instincts. And we need people in the room, as they do, to talk about kind of, why did you respond to this? Is there subconscious bias going on here? How do we address that? What is in service of equity? And I think we could think about similar kind of horizontal and bottom-up sort of citizen-led processes for accountability and interaction with public servants as well.
Interesting. I wish we had time to pursue that further, but we're coming close to the end of our time. You've just been named one of the 100 most influential academics in government. So clearly, what you were saying about these things is being heard not just in academia, but also in government, and is having an impact there. How do you achieve that? I think many of my colleagues would love to know. I mean, I should just say and it's really striking doing this podcast where we're talking about people's research, but we're also talking about how it's important for the wider world, not just for academia. And I'm quite struck that many of our colleagues are really keen that their research should have real world impact. They're not just focused on impact in academia, but it's a really difficult thing to do. So how do you do it?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess. As maybe you could tell from my first sort of blanching response, that I have to be honest, I have not thought super hard about this, but let me still answer, since you've given me the time to do so. And I guess I would start by saying that, so it's not the case. So my production process isn't that I do the research and then I figure out how to get governments to listen to it, right? So my production process is that I answer questions because it seems to me, working with governments, that this is a question worth answering. Sometimes it's kind of on my own initiative, and sometimes because it is directly asked by a policymaker, and I think, oh, what's the answer to that? And then I go around. I should say, to my colleagues at UCL who haven't yet I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting. So one, I would say, downside of having me as a colleague is that I will sometimes show up in your office and say, hey, somebody asked me this question. What do we know about this? This feels more your area than mine. What do we know? Is this an interesting question? Do we have a clear answer? Because if we have a clear answer, I'd love to just kind of take that information back. If we don't have a clear answer, this feels like a good question to me. Should we figure out what the answer is? And so it's less that I do the research and then implant it in governments. And it's more that the questions come from things that seem policy relevant somewhere. And once I've conducted the research, or in most cases, we've conducted the research, it seems like they might have application even beyond the context they started with. And so, in some ways, I think, the kind of production process of academia, where sort of so in grad school, I learned that the way you come up with a good academic paper is you look at the research, you look at the literature, you think about everything that exists, and you think about what's missing. That sounds wonderful. I have never successfully accomplished that in my life. So my questions always come from the world of practice. And because of that, I guess they naturally go back to it. And so I suppose for academics interested in that, I would say, if you want your work to matter to policymakers, maybe it should start from policymakers rather than policymakers only coming in at kind of the end at like a dissemination phase of your model. That said, I'm sure there are many, many ways to have your work have take up. And I don't mean to suggest mine is the only one, but I guess that's how I go about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, some listeners will be aware that I'm in the Constitution Unit part of the Department of Political Science, and it's very much the approach that we take as well. The questions that we start with are the ones in the real world, not the ones in the academic literature. But as you say, there is value in both of those approaches. I mean, I guess an implication of what you're saying is potentially that academics just need to kind of get out a bit more. And so you're an academic who has had a previous life in the policy world, if you like. Sure. And you're an academic who continues to have many conversations with people in government, in NGOs, and so on. And I guess that's where you get your inspiration from for a lot of the work that you do. And maybe more of us should have that kind of hinterland, to use a word that's sometimes used to describe these things, than we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think for those who are interested, I would say that, if you were willing to kind of meet policymakers on their own terms and to have conversations where you have no idea where they're going or whether they'll be useful or whether they'll result in publications, et cetera, I hear academics and policymakers very frequently talk in kind of general terms about the other category, right?
Yeah.
Usually in broad strokes, as if they're kind of like inaccessible and have the wrong motives and aren't interested in the same things. And of course, the language is very different. The way you approach the conversation is very different. But that's not my experience. My experience is that there are lots of people who are politicians, who are bureaucrats, who are working for NGOs, who are anywhere you want to be in the public system, who are interested in talking about ideas, as long as they don't have to go and read, 80,000 words to get there, right? Because they don't have that kind of time, and who want to think about these things, who experience things in their lives and want to talk about them. And sometimes, the job can feel a little bit like, not quite therapy, because it's not like I'm providing prescriptions or guidance, but, I can feel more sometimes like I'm hearing from a senior policymaker or a junior policymaker about their lives and their attempt to kind of step back and think about the river as a whole, rather than just, kind of stand in the stream. And that's to me what the academic toolkit, at least vis-a-vis public policy, if it's not for that, I'm not sure what it's for, I guess. I think my job as I see it is to help, if it's to help kind of create a positive impact on the world, then that has to start with the people, since I'm not one of them or no longer one of them, the people actually in the middle of the stream trying to do things. And I think you will find ready audiences. I've never heard the phrase hinterland in this context, but wherever you travel, however you define that geography, whatever the geography is you're interested in, at least my experience is that people may be suspicious at first, but they won't stay that way for long if you seem earnest and engaged, and you care about the things, about helping them, not about helping yourself as a result of the interaction. And that's likely to pay off in lots of different ways.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. It's the mission of this podcast to encourage those conversations and get people listening to each other across those traditional divides. And it's been fascinating talking with you about it today. So many thanks to Dan Honig. And we've been discussing two books. We've been discussing first Navigation by Judgment, Why and When Top-Down Management of Foreign Aid Doesn't Work. That's by Dan Honig. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And Dan's second book, Mission-Driven Bureaucrats, is on its way. Next week, we're looking at the pedagogy of politics. A new centre has just been established here in the UCL Department of Political Science to research issues relating to how we teach about politics, and we'll be joined by several of its founders. As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.